Also, someone from the Quad City Times was just here a bit ago, so great coverage from the River City here as well. So really exciting. It'll really help us spread the word about the campaign. No problem. A couple people might be trickling in, and we're also okay, great. And one of our other speakers is also going to be coming a bit late, but he'll be here soon. So as most of you know, my name is Leann Felder, and I'm the Davenport field organizer with the Let Me Decide campaign to make GE labeling the law. I'm going to start off with a quick introduction, and then we'll hear from the two great speakers, one focusing on the environmental impacts of genetically engineered foods, and the other focusing on health impacts. And then everyone can check out our poster of photo petitions that Dave and Judy were really key in making, people holding up signs about why they each individually care about this issue. To start off, all Americans can agree that we need to know what's in our food so that we can make informed decisions about what we're eating. 90% of Americans want genetically engineered foods to be labeled. GE foods can pose risks to our health and our environment. There's a lot of uncertainty around these foods and their impacts, and the fact that they aren't labeled means that people can't choose to avoid them if they want to. Just as labels list fat and sodium and salt content, they should also say whether or not they contain genetically engineered ingredients. Anything less is misleading.
Some of those things there to pull that out.
Sorry. No, thank you for coming. So we'll have the speakers begin this one. Perfect. Products should just say if they contain genetically engineered ingredients, and really anything less is misleading and leaves consumers in the dark. 50 other countries require that genetically engineered foods be labeled, including the European Union, Japan, Australia, and Brazil. The fact that the US is lagging behind on this issue is really unacceptable. It's clear that the vast majority of food companies will continue to ignore consumers' demands unless they're held accountable by law. The biotechnology industry has spent over $500 million between 1999 and 2009 lobbying and campaign contributions to make sure that genetically engineered food regulation remains weak and that they remain unlabeled and that consumers remain in the dark. Industry has never been very successful at regulating itself because profits are always going to be the #1 priority. That's why we need laws to make sure that our free market works well, because we have transparency and fairness for all, and that industry knows how to behave. Reining these corporations in is really critical to reforming our dysfunctional food system. There's a reason that more than 50 other countries require that GE foods be labeled, and as a beacon of democracy and freedom, the US should really be leading the world in consumer information. Instead, they're lagging behind and they're really in last place in GE foods. It's time to change that. It's time to make GE labeling a law. That's why we're asking Senator Joe Sang to support GE labeling legislation and give consumers the right to decide what they're putting into their bodies. So now I'm going to introduce Jerry Neff, a local environmental activist who's been a longtime member of the Sierra Club, and he'll be talking about the environmental impacts of genetically engineered foods. Jerry.
Thanks, Leann. Well, some of this is kind of repetition, but I guess that's the way we learn when we hear it over and over again. So my name's Jerry Neff, and I'm concerned about the food we eat, where it comes from, and what's in it. Genetically engineered foods pose significant threats to the environment. The long-term environmental impacts of these crops have not yet been fully tested. The FDA, Food and Drug Administration, does no independent safety testing and instead relies on data submitted by biotechnology companies. The FDA and the USDA, Department of Agriculture, have abdicated their responsibility to keep America's food supply safe by approving untested, unlabeled, and potentially unsafe GE foods, which is why legislation is needed to require that GE foods be labeled. Here are some of the known environmental impacts of GE foods. GE crops usually use more pesticides and herbicides than non-GE crops. These chemicals then contaminate our land, rivers, and our bodies. Roundup-ready crops are known to increase Roundup glyphosate use. That's a chemical that has been linked to health and environmental problems. Now, super weeds and pests have become resistant to GE-affiliated herbicides and pesticides and require more toxic chemicals to be applied to crops. So it seems like the more of that stuff we use, the more they become immune to it, and you have to come up with something different or a little stronger. I want to also address a myth, the false claim that GE foods are helping farmers to adjust to global climate change. Biotech firms have promised high yield and drought-resistant GE seeds, but by 2012, only one variety of drought-tolerant corn has been approved. Monsanto's approved drought-tolerant corn has overestimated yield benefits. Crop research has yet to achieve the complex interactions between genes that are necessary for plants to endure environmental stressors such as drought. For too long now, pesticide companies have been permitted to sneak genetically engineered ingredients into our food supply, and consumers are fed up. GE food labels are a simple, common sense step towards informing and empowering consumers about the food we eat. Labeling GE foods will allow consumers to decide whether or not they want to support foods that create such environmental dangers as I just mentioned, including increased herbicide use, genetic contamination, and the creation of super weeds. It's time to make GE labeling the law. That's why we are asking Senator Joe Sang to support GE labeling and let consumers decide what foods we are buying and in turn what those foods are doing to our environment.
Thank you, Jerry, for that. And we'll hear from another great speaker, Dr. Rexroth, who's going to be focusing on the health impacts of
Good afternoon. Is it afternoon now?
Yes.
I'm a chiropractor, a clinical nutritionist. I've been in practice for over 23 years. I have a radio show, Health Matters, on Saturday morning at 9:30 when the football games are not preempting me, okay, on WOC Talk Radio. Leann has asked me to speak this morning, and I first of all have a couple of personal things to say. The companies that do the genetically engineered foods are asking us to trust them. And yet, there's a long history of abuse in the area of pesticides and from these very companies. For me, the experience personally goes all the way back to the 50s. When I was a young person, just a few years old, the companies that produced DDT were advertising. The slogan was, DDT is good for me. And I actually remember seeing on the television ads of school grounds, playgrounds being sprayed with DDT and the young children playing in the toxic mist. My father, who had some rental property at that point, was going to get rid of some insects, and he mixed up a batch of DDT, and since it's so good for you, and stuff, he stirred it with his bare hand. And spent the next several days in the hospital with acute hepatitis, almost died. I was just a couple years old at that particular point. And of course, I don't remember it specifically, but the story has been retold many, many times, as you can imagine. It was still not even looked at carefully until Rachel Carson wrote her book Silent Spring, and then it all came out, but it had a horrible environmental impact. And unfortunately, the tradition of a lack of testing and a lack of especially long-term testing has gone on with the genetically engineered foods as well. For example, until just recently, there had been no studies done by the industry, and that's the only person that has done, people that have done the studies, by the way. The industry has been, with their patents on the seeds, has restricted the use of those seeds for research purposes. A lot of you don't really realize how tight the grip on these seeds has been. In other words, they will only give their seeds to scientists that they know are going to give them the results they want. That's what it comes down to. If a scientist possesses the seeds and does experiments with the seeds without having received them from the company like Monsanto, they are subject to arrest and prosecution for patent violations. Now, what scientist is going to do that? I mean, research is expensive enough. To put themselves on the line like that, it's not going to happen. So you have to realize that this has been a chokehold on the science. It has not been allowed to happen. Now, recently in France, there was a 2-year study, and I'm not sure how this person got around the patents or whether they even did get around them, I'm not sure. But in France, there's been a study, and it was the first long-term study, and not a real long-term study, except it was done with mice, and 2 years is a long time for a mouse. But the study showed that, as with all the 90-day studies, the mice were just fine in the first 90 days. And yet shortly after that, the health effects of liver dysfunction and genetic alterations, and particularly tumors, became a real problem with the genetically engineer-fed mice. And then also there were 3 groups actually, but one of the groups had the glyphosate, also the pesticide of Monsanto's pesticide Roundup, glyphosate, and they had some trace amounts of that in their diet also. And all of the mice with genetically engineered foods and with the glyphosate started developing tumors at a much higher rate than the control group that was not fed the glyphosate or the genetically engineered foods, just regular mouse chops. So the health effects have been demonstrated. Of course, the industry came out and said this is a bad study, not enough mice were tested, etc. But what they were unwilling, of course, to then fund a long-term study that did have adequate number of mice to be definitive and volunteer the seed and to feed these mice. So it's suspicion has to be very high. Now, the assumption that allows them to do this is what is called the substantial equivalence assumption. Now, that's kind of some technical terms. How many of you have encountered that particular phrase before, substantial equivalence? Well, let me explain to you what the assumption is. Now, keep in mind that when you're talking about genetic engineering, you're talking about shooting genes from one species to another, or even from one kingdom to another. I mean, the plant and animal kingdom is quite a large separation at this point, at least. And shooting genes with a gene gun into the nucleus of other species or other, members of another kingdom. And statistically, a certain number of those genes will actually take and allow for reproduction. Most of them won't, by the way. Most of the cells will not reproduce, but some of them do. And they take those and they test them and they try to get them going. And when they do them, they've got a new, in essence, a new strain, and sometimes even probably a new species. They do it with that. They do it with infecting the cells with viruses that carry recombinant DNA into the nucleus. All of us, by the way, have that happening to some extent. We get the flu, and what happens? The flu comes in, commandeers your cells, commandeers the nucleus of your cells, and turns your cells into a virus factory. So, that's just a biological thing. But what they do is they have specific genes that they usher into the nucleus of the cell and create a new genetic characteristic. Now, frankly, I'm a pro-science person. I love science. And when they talk like this, I get excited, right? And many of you do too. It's great science. How can you say it's not? It's wonderful stuff. But the question is, Are we supposed to be the guinea pigs that are subject to the testing? It's kind of like this. Okay, now let me just finish my definition of the substantial equivalence first. The assumption was that normal breeding, where you just select the characteristics that you want from a plant, you raise this plant, you've cultivated it for a couple of years, and it, for example, can survive cold weather. All right? So what do? You take the seeds from that plant and you replant them, right? And you keep purifying it until all of your seeds manifest that characteristic by selective breeding. Well, you take that and you say, now this is the substantial equivalence argument. That kind of process of seed saving and seed choosing is substantially equivalent to shooting the nucleus full of foreign DNA for a gene gun, or by infecting it, etc., cross species or even cross kingdom, which has never been done. And then you say, well, you see the proteins that are involved in this are substantially the same. Therefore, the two processes are substantially equivalent. Therefore, according to the FDA, we don't need testing. Does that sink in a little bit? That's what's being said. That's what's being claimed in the substantial equivalence argument. So, no testing, except volunteer testing by the seed companies, by the companies who hope to and do, in fact, profit from this process. All we want, basically, is the tests. We want more science. And that's one of the things that is protected by food labeling. Right now, here we are in America, the American country of freedom, right? We have freedom, we have choice, we elect our officials. Excuse me. We have choice. That's the thing that we love most about being Americans, or at least we should love most about being Americans. And yet, at this point, do we even have a choice about what foods we eat? The answer is
No.
not very much,
Not so much.
right? You're not even, if there are health consequences to genetically modified or genetically engineered foods, you are not even allowed to know it. Because right now, there is no choice. You have no choice because you have no information.
Right.
Without the labeling, we have no information. And so that limits our freedom as Americans. So to a large extent, this is not just an issue, a health issue even. I mean, it is a health issue, but it's not just merely a health issue. It's a freedom issue. It's an identity for us as Americans issue.
It's a basic right.
Basic right, exactly. And that's why when we talk to Joe Seng about these issues, I mean, he represents, I'm an Illinois person, but he represents Iowans and their basic rights and the laws that protect those rights. And so when you approach him on these issues, you need to let him know very, very strongly that you really are concerned that you are being robbed of your fundamental right, your freedom to know, and your freedom to make your own health choices, and your freedom to opt out of the guinea pig status that we've all been placed in over this particular issue.
Did you see my sign?
I did see your sign, that's good. Yes. So what I would encourage you to do is become more involved in this movement to label genetic foods, and become very, very active when it comes to writing and contacting and influencing with your vote, but also with your information to influence the legislators in Iowa to label genetically engineered foods. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rexroth, for speaking, and also Jerry. Those are the main speakers for today. So we'll wrap up with a quick picture next to our poster and holding up some of our signs that we're going to send out to some of the media sources that are covering this, just to get the word out far and wide. And on the theme of talking to Senator Joe Seng, we're actually meeting with him next week and getting to present our arguments and show the over 700 postcards that we've collected and the over 15 coalition sign-ons that we've gotten from local organizations who are all asking him to be a champion for this issue and to protect really ensure our right to know what we're eating.
Do you have time for a couple questions?
Yeah, definitely.
You early at the beginning of your presentation, you said that 90% of Americans want to know the source of, what was that stat?
Want GD foods to be labeled.
And where does that derive
It's
from?
on, I can give you this fact sheet, but it was a 2012 study.
Okay.
From that one?
Super.
That was the 2008 study by CBS News and New York Times.
Okay.
That was 87%.
Okay.
People wanted it, and then there was one in 2012 that actually isn't on this fact sheet yet that showed it was over 90%.
And what do the critics of GE, genetic engineering, say to those that say humans have been genetically engineering crops for millennia? What's the difference?
Yeah, well,
Hybridizing is not GE.
Yeah, that's kind of the argument that I was covering.
Yeah.
Basically that they're substantially equivalent, and what they're saying is that all you're doing is moving around a lot of proteins anyway,
Mm-hmm.
and so whether you do it one way or another is
Mhm.
equivalent.
Mm-hmm.
But that argument does not depend on testing. That argument is an assumption.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yes.
Understood.
Great question. It's a
Yeah.
question I had the first time I saw the movie, the Genetic Roulette movie.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And the thing was, I thought, how is that any different than what they've been doing, Orlock did with wheat?
Mm-hmm.
You know, that was a hybridization where the parents of the wheat plants were
Mhm.
all wheat. They're doing things now that, like for example, to make Kevlar, they're injecting spider genes into goats, using the milk to make Kevlar. Plus, the Genetic Roulette movie pointed out there's a new organism that's deadly. And he was alerted, that our government was alerted to that. It's unknown, they can't test it they're testing it for its properties, but it's an offshoot. And so far it kills livestock in like 45 days.
Wow.
But that's a big secret. These are all brand new organisms, and that's what our gut can't process.
Right.
The thing you have to distinguish is the goal from the method.
Mm-hmm.
The goal, the stated goal at least, of a lot of the genetically modified foods is to make them more drought resistant, more cold weather resistant, et cetera. And the goal may be a good goal.
Mhm.
You can't really argue about the goal in the sense of that, but the method or the way you get to that goal can be substantially different. So in terms of in terms of the goal of breeding and the goal of genetically modifying crops is substantially the same. But the method may be radical enough and one may be dangerous enough that you want to make sure you do adequate testing.
And the main concern is that, or main argument is that they haven't been fully tested,
No,
just
they
like
haven't
you were
been
saying, and
Right.
we should have the right to know either way whether we're eating them or not with this label.
You see,
This
in Europe,
process only
in
started in '96.
Okay.
In Europe, there is a principle that they use to decide on these issues, and it's called the Cautionary Principle.
Okay.
The Cautionary Principle illustrated is like this. If you've got a genie that's potentially very dangerous,
Mm-hmm.
you better know how to put him back in the bottle before
Right.
you let him out,
Right.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the Europeans have almost uniformly, either by banning genetically modified foods or requiring very, very careful labeling,
Mm-hmm.
they have said, we don't know how to get this particular genie back in the bottle. Once the pollen is in the air, et cetera, we don't know if we can get it back in the bottle. So we're not going to let it out of the bottle until we know that, until we know it's safe, or until we know we can get it back in the bottle. And so the Cautionary Principle has made it so that genetically engineered foods basically don't exist in Europe and several other countries. India has now banned it. China, a lot of most of the big countries have just said we're not ready yet because we don't want this genie out of the bottle until we know it's safe.
So I have two more questions,
Yeah.
if you don't mind, real quick. You talked about having Senator Sang support legislation to require labeling in Iowa. Has that legislation been drafted? Is there a document to look at of what that legislation language looks like?
Yeah, there's that Senator Joe Bolcom is
Okay.
going to be working, tweaking, and introducing in January.
Okay.
Also, just to mention, there's also a bill being introduced in Illinois. It will be similar, and they haven't been finalized. The language hasn't been finalized, but they'll be pretty close to the model.
So that
legislation.
draft is not available yet of the language, legislative language?
No, it's not available yet, but we'll.
Okay, okay.
What area is that Slocum from?
Bolcom, he's
Bolcom.
from Iowa City.
And, you know, you made the comment that industry's never been successful at regulating itself, that's why we need laws. And I'm curious what you would say to the critics that say, take fracking, for instance. Everybody familiar with fracking? You know, that is an industry that's governed by the EPA, among others. And under the Bush administration, the EPA gave a variance to the oil industry to say they did not have to divulge the nature of the chemicals in the water they were using to frack the land with. So subsequently, when somebody tried to sue because their cattle were dying, they had no case, they had no standing in court to show damage because they couldn't bring any evidence forward about where the damage came from. So the critics would say more government laws actually result in more damage to the people because the government doesn't actually do a good job of regulating even when they're set up to do that. So in this instance, what would you say that all of a sudden you have pick an agency that would manage this labeling process? They're going to be suspect to influence, just like the EPA was, to create variances for special interest, and subsequently we won't really know if the labeling is accurate necessarily. So
Yeah, that's a great question, and right now actually there are 3 agencies that oversee GE Foods, like different aspects of it,
Mhm.
the FDA, the USDA, and the EPA, and that's part of the problem, that there's some confusion, and we really feel that none of them are doing an adequate job.
They're all-
And that's why we want labeling, so it's just very clear,
Mhm.
you know, people can make a clear choice if they want to eat them or not, because
Mhm.
there are concerns
Mhm.
about whether the FDA is doing a good enough job
Mhm.
of regulating these foods and making sure that they're tested fully.
Ultimately, this campaign may turn ultimately into a election finance reform movement,
Mhm.
because that's
Mhm.
where it really comes down to make government
Right.
actually responsible
Right.
to the people rather than to the money.
right. That's a
So
big problem.
that's a few years
I
in the future.
concur. And my last question, I promise, because you guys bring up a lot of stuff that it's meaningful. You talk about the freedom to know, the choice, and so forth. And with all due respect, if you're a senator, like Joe's saying, you took an oath to the Constitution, all right, the state and the federal Constitution, which right in the Bill of Rights is he not protecting by not enforcing labeling?
That's a good question.
That's a good question. I can't really speak to that because I'm not well versed on the
Okay.
state constitution.
I think it's one that the campaign might want to consider pondering, because when you throw out the freedom to choose, the freedom to know, you know, at the end of the day, there is an empirical Bill of Rights that they're supposed to enforce, and if you can nail that down, that might help your cause.
But I
The
think this is
Illinois
one of the
Constitution does have a clause in it that ensures that all the citizens of the state of Illinois have the right to a healthy environment and to their health. I can't remember the exact wording of it, but there is,
well-being.
yeah, well-being and a healthy environment, that type of, along that line. I don't remember the exact wording. But Illinois has it, I don't know.
The strict constitutionalists would point back to the fracking example, where without the EPA, there's no government regulation on fracking, but when there's injury and harm, you know, I leased my land to Halliburton and they fracked my land, but then my sheep died, right? Well, then there's harm. I should be able to go and adjudicate that harm.
Right.
But because the government's actually involved, I can't get relief in the courts because they get a variance. You see what I mean? And that's where your injury, the rights that are being, that's a property right that's being violated, you know, if you will. And so that's where that would come from. And I would throw that out for consideration.
Sounds like a legal matter.
Well, yeah, it is, yeah. But I appreciate what you guys are doing. I
We want
will,
it to become a
you
legal
know.
matter, that's why that's important, yeah.
The
Yeah, that's
people who
good.
did the original testing for all of these organizations, Monsanto, DuPont, Syngenta and all of that, they were fired, and their results were absconded by the
Repressed.
corporations. They were never allowed to release those results originally in 1996. They were so shocking that these people
Yeah,
just
Yeah.
couldn't believe it. So we never heard about that.
Yeah.
You know, this whole thing's kind of a symptom of what's wrong with our government today, is that most of these the FDA, the EPA, they're all run by industry insiders. It's all.
Who used to work for Monsanto.
Yes, exactly.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
Same with the EPA. Used to work for Halliburton. Is running the EPA. It's phenomenal.
It's no wonder there's so many people who want to secede from the United States, because
Yeah.
they're figuring out that the government doesn't work for them anymore. It's working for them,
Yeah.
not for us.
Billionaires.
And, you know, people, well, that's Obama. No, it's not Obama. Obama's just like the other
Yeah.
puppets they've had in there the last 20 years. And
Absolutely.
they all are, they do the bidding of the master.
We forget that the original laws were created to govern the government, not the people, actually.
That's right. That's right.
Been inverted. Well, I would look forward to reading the advanced draft of the model legislation, because it's one thing to ask for the order, do the legislation, but what's in the order? You know,
Right.
what's it going to say?
I agree.
I'll try to get that. to
That'd
you.
be awesome.
Thank you for your questions.
What's your name, sir?
My name's Todd McGreevy. I publish the River Cities Reader newspaper.
Oh,
God, so.
I just had one idea. I've been doing it here for quite a while. Calling the company and asking them, you know, if some food in there is genetically modified. There are some companies that, as you can see, non-GMOs and a lot of things. Well, they will look it up for you, and hopefully they're telling the truth, and they'll tell you if it's genetically modified or not. And just if we could get a lot of the people to make these phone calls to the companies, just saying that, well, I want to know, I don't want to put any genetically modified foods in
That's
my
a good
body.
point.
Would you please start labeling your foods? Otherwise, I'm going to just eat the foods that say non-GMO or organic, excuse me.
Oh, yeah.
Right, and you can email them too, even if you know, some people will try to make phone calls, you can certainly email. All these websites do have, or the food companies do
Yeah.
have contact me forms, and I've even contacted certain food companies and said, hey, your all-natural ketchup you claim is all-natural, has high fructose corn syrup, so how can that be all-natural?
Exactly.
Well, the other thing you can do too, if you shop at Hy-Vee, on the bottom of the receipt, they have the email for all the, whatever store manager of that store you just bought from. And so I've emailed a few, and most of the managers are very responsive. Now, that doesn't mean that I always get the answer I want, but that they do read the email, and somebody in management gets back to you. And I've also written Aldi about things, and they've been, again, you know, not that they've changed all their policies, but they respond, and you can tell the letters I've gotten back, it's not just a rote letter. They read my letter and they responded to what I sent in. So I think your point about that is excellent.
Great, yeah. We
If we
definitely
just
need
get
to
millions
go
of
over
people
lots
to
of
keep
different-
calling these food industries, then they might start labeling without getting something passed.
That's been referred to in the past as the power of the purse.
Yeah.
Yeah.
right.
Voting with your dollar. I always tell people, vote with your dollar.
Yeah.
It's more important than your vote at the ballot box.
Yeah, yeah, we're really just trying to allow people to do just
know.
that, you know, right?
Is anybody going to talk briefly about Prop 37 in California?
I can speak briefly about that. I just want to also say, like, this is running a little bit over, so anyone who needs to leave, like, definitely run out. Yeah, thanks for coming in.
But I just thought in terms of the power of the purse and boycotting those companies, does everybody here know about Prop 37 in California?
Yep.
Anybody not? Okay. That we should start boycotting those companies that contributed to the anti-Prop 37 campaign.
Yes.
And not just write the company, but write the grocery stores too and say, we're not buying crap because they contributed this money.
Pepsi, Nestle.
Yes, I mean, there's a whole list and you can get online and
30
it's.
plus 40 companies.
Yeah,
something
over
like that.
$45 million was contributed to defeat Prop 37.
That's
Well,
on the
there's
website.
including
If
food
you-
companies that normally are organic, which is.
But some of them are owned by Pepsi and Kraft, and so it's misleading. at
Does
best.
anybody need any more proof of voter fraud than that? I mean, they didn't convince anybody, that's not the accurate vote, there's no way.
I don't believe it either.
Well, and the other thing you could Google is that there's actually I think over 1 million votes that weren't counted. This one reporter did some research and just contacted the 4 largest companies in California, Orange County, and I don't remember the other 3. And there were over 1 million votes that had not been counted. And so, exactly the point.
I actually went to the Secretary of State's webpage and checked that, and they have the Secretary of State is claiming 100% counted now. Just FYI, because I did get
But
that same email.
yeah, but what's the number that were counted late? I mean, you know, some were counted late, and what's the
Right,
difference? That's what
right.
I'd like to know.
Yeah.
You know, clearly they weren't all counted election day.
No, that is accurate, and state law doesn't require them to. State law only requires
Right.
them to report, each county to report by December 7th.
Right.
For everybody.
So what's the updated numbers? That's what I want to know.
Well, if you go to the California Secretary of State, they'll say 100% reporting, 100% counted, 100% reporting,
Right.
and it lost 53-47 or something like that.
But that was the original statistics. That's why I think they're,
I'm not disagreeing with you, I'm just saying the Secretary of State is claiming the 100% have been counted now, because I saw that same comment.
Thank you for bringing that up. It's really important, and like, this is really prevalent in the news right now. And it actually was like a lot closer than people were predicting, the 47-53, with the intense amount of money that was thrown into it by these industries. And I think it just proves how important this work is to keep the cause in the headlines and on people's minds, and also to build education and so that people know about this issue before it's brought to the ballot or to the legislature, to make sure that people are educated and won't be influenced by these negative ads and misleading ads.
I found it interesting that in California as well as everywhere else, that the primary phrase that is used by the GMO companies to justify what their science is this. It's a negative phrase. It says there's no scientific evidence that GMOs are harmful to human health. Now, you can make that claim. And by the way, it can be true. I mean,
for 90 days.
well, yeah, right. It can be true because as long as there is no science, it's true. And as long as there is no science that these short studies that don't show harm, it's true. And yet the fact that there is no real long-term science done at all, of course, makes it very, very suspect to people who know that. But the statement itself is so incredibly powerful, you know. But it shows a complete misunderstanding of what has in the past been called skeptical science. Namely, you're always skeptical, and science can only continue to amount evidence. It never proves anything, but it does continue to mount evidence. And it's not, the science is not done because people are not skeptical enough, then it's not really, doesn't qualify as traditional Western science. You've got to be skeptical, not in a, just saying, well, if no science shows that it's harmful, then it's safe. That would be an illogical conclusion.
As a political statement.
As a
That's
political
effective.
statement, right.
That's all.
That's exactly what it is.
Manipulating people.
Right.
One thing out of that Proposition 37 that's heartening is that the little island off the coast of Washington, San Juan, has made GMOs illegal.
To grow. They can still sell them.
Oh, I know.
Packaging.
Jeff Smith's letter said that it can't even be sold in the county.
All right, I'm just quoting the
So,
article I read, so.
I thought that
Well,
was heartening.
There's several counties, and so I don't know if all their regulations match, but there's several counties in the US that have outlawed GMOs, but I don't know the fine print of growing versus selling.
Yeah,
And if
That
anybody
was
wants
good news.
to know the companies to boycott, if you go to Food Democracy, there's a very extensive list there of Monsanto and Dow and Bayer and Pepsi and Kraft and the other companies that, were anti-labeling.
and so thank you all for coming again and for all your comments. We're gonna have to run out to be out of here pretty soon. Yeah, if everyone wants to just stand up and we can hold the signs and take a big picture, and hopefully we'll all be in the Quad City Times.
What is it, reader?
Hey, I'm Todd McGreevy.
Kurt Rexroth.
Hi,
Nice
Kurt.
meeting you,
Do you have a
Todd.
card?
Yeah, I do.